Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. On my second attempt to record this video, again, like I keep saying, I keep bitching and moaning about the wind. It's just tearing this recording up. You should see it. I stood out back for 15 minutes, watered the lawn, everything was great. And then I sit down to record, and all of a sudden God goes, "Behold the wind." So here we go. So this episode is a redo of episode 2 from 2015. And we've had a lot of time to think about things. We've done all kinds of different approaches to evolution. I'm going to review some stuff we talked about, of course, from the first version of this episode. The other thing is, listening to the first season is not for everybody because it's like really up close mic work for at least the first, 40 episodes, something like that. I do apologize. I was still figuring this thing out. But evolution is a very interesting one because what I have discovered in my lifetime, you tell me if this happened to you. You'll hear people argue over evolution, but when you sit down each side of the argument, perhaps a creationist on one side and an evolutionist on the other side, and you really ask them what they know about evolution and the theories of evolution, either way, they don't really know much about what they're talking about. And it's not enough for either side to say, well, it doesn't matter, I just know. All right. So what I'm going to do, hopefully, is gift you with the full argument of the whole thing in a way that will be very, very simple for you to explain to another human being, such that you will be able to be very, very solidified in your opinion either way. Now, at the same time, if there's something I mention in here that you know is different, I don't want you to get all upset. I want you to give me the research that would contradict or provide the information that is more accurate or more detailed. And I'm going to acknowledge some areas where you're going to know more details about a particular thing, and I totally welcome you to say, what you mentioned a minute, this is this little piece of paper over here and that kind of thing. Because I want to continue to follow this as we do other episodes. So what is the argument? The argument is obviously very simple. Did we evolve out of chaos in the universe, or were we scientifically designed by either a group of people or a single individual or a trickle down of the two? Meaning there's a central consciousness to the universe that makes several layers of beings. And then, we're getting close to being able to do this ourselves, even though we cannot gift inanimate matter with life. That has never been done, right? We don't have dead matter and then we shock it like a Frankenstein episode and all of a sudden it's living. That has never occurred. We could duplicate cells, we can grow ears, we can do all kinds of stuff, but you always, in this world right now, in the 21st century, have to start with something that's already alive. And that doesn't bother evolutionists whatsoever because they just sort of arrogantly assume they'll figure it out at some point. I'm pretty sure it has to do with some ethereal sciences, and I'm pretty sure it has to do with some acknowledgement of other layers of existence that machines currently don't detect. But that'll be for the end of the episode. So I'm going to give you sort of a crazy analogy so that we can really think about this, because even though it's crazy and a tiny bit absurd, it really is getting at the theory. Now, we see ourselves as obviously higher-end constructs of life. We are made of a bunch of subatomic things that are occurring. And there's arguments down at the subatomic level. But at some point, you have mechanisms in your body, and there are orders in which those mechanisms dictate to other mechanisms what you are. Probably the most fundamental mechanism that the human body has to dictate who you are physically are the protein patterns that are inside your chromosomes. Those dictate what your DNA do. So we could focus on DNA things, but DNA is supposed to be following what a protein pattern does. I'll give you an example. When the Genome Project was finished in the 90s, they were so excited to tell you that you and a housefly, you and a chimpanzee, you and an earthworm are almost identical beings. I mean, you're over 90% sharing DNA material. That is because they're looking in the wrong place. As Bruce Lipton will educate you, it's like saying you bought say a half a dozen IKEA furniture pieces to load up your new apartment or your house. And as you pull them out, because let's say you pick the same finish, so all these pieces look very, very similar. They're using the same little wood dowels, same type of screws, same little, coupling devices, even the same tools to turn those things. You might be able to say, well, man, look, it's all made of the same stuff. But if that was the case, then the instruction sheet inside each one of the pieces of furniture would be damn near identical, and they're not. Your protein patterns are the instructions, the schematics. Your DNA is simply the pieces and parts. Sort of like getting a big Lego kit. There's Lego kits that are $500 that allow you to build a pretty big Millennium Falcon. Yeah, every once in a while they give you some unique pieces because there's no other way to achieve the wild shape. But when I was a kid, all the Legos were damn near identical. Your family could buy you expansion packs, but that really meant you got maybe a couple new pieces and you got a boatload of the stuff you already had. In the late 70s, they started giving you schematics for space stations and trucks and cars and all kinds of stuff. Still using the same pieces. So I want to orient your brain as we start talking about what is causing, potentially, changes in the composition of something. Because that's super duper important when you're going to be thinking about how evolution is supposed to be working from the scientific standpoint. And sort of the creationistic view of the counter theory to evolution is that the schematic is fixed. The schematic was designed by God. We use all these scientific pieces and parts to create whatever life form we're discussing. But the schematic stays the same. Scientists are trying to say the schematic gets changed. And so let's go there first. If you took a lump of coal, which is a crystalline structure, and you put it on a tabletop, and you could fast forward time in a simulator, and nothing ever touched it, is it going to be a different thing 1 billion years later? Because if evolution's involved with a lump of coal, then that lump of coal will change all by itself. Well, chances are it's not going to turn into a diamond, because the method by which we think this occurs, and we're pretty sure because cubic zirconians use it all the time, is that extreme pressure has to be applied on that lump of coal. I've seen it done on internet videos. And that changes the state of the coal. So an outside force has to interact with the coal to get it to change to be something else. Interesting. Now, I mentioned a caterpillar going into a butterfly just recently. That, for me, is not evolution whatsoever. That's a metabolic state. I don't think evolutionists would call it that. But a caterpillar finishing its growth pattern has a transitional phase. Don't get that confused with evolution. If at some point it went into its cocoon and then popped out and it was a grasshopper, that would be something to write down on a piece of paper. So I think that most of the evolution that is significant to a man, which is where did we come from, it has to do with the initial thought process was that our genetic sequence has a long-term, very slow-moving caterpillar effect. That if you were to leave our lump of coal on the table, it eventually turns into something else. A monkey, a chimpanzee, a gorilla, a primate of some sort will eventually evolve. Maybe perhaps in, some hominid, then some Neanderthal, then some human being. Because they have found skulls and skeletons of a different species that have a Russian doll sort of arrangement, meaning little tiny ones to really huge ones. In their mind, those are the same thing. Now, I don't know if a silverback gorilla's sperm can impregnate a rhesus monkey. I don't know. You let me know. I think there's probably a species barrier in there that may prevent that from occurring, because I'm sure some weirdo would put the two together and be selling whatever the hell comes out of that. In terms of the physical capability, a gorilla could have sex with a chimpanzee. Chimpanzee could have sex with an orangutan. with the baboon, all these things could be cross-pollinating. So I'm thinking that there's some species barriers, which is actually fairly interesting. But the first question we have to ask is, does a primate, if left in a vacuum, fed, and there's no aging process necessarily in terms of it dying, are the protein patterns inside this being going to turn into a Homo sapien sapien? Is the skull going to completely reform? Are the bones going to completely reform? Because their skeleton is, again, similar in having a rib cage, having arms, having a skull, just like every other animal in the world. But because it really resembles, in certain metrics, a human being, there's this link made in evolution. Well, how would a protein pattern change over time if it wasn't directly built into its sequence? And then how would that protein pattern change very slowly over time without any other interaction from the outside world? Because we're going to go there next. It would have to be some minuscule little gear mechanism of some sort. I'm being metaphorical, of course, whereby which when the protein pattern divides and it creates children protein patterns during cell mitosis, cell replication, that there is some state change, some almost flaw in its capability of replicating itself utterly perfectly, and in such a way that it doesn't create some sort of monster deformity by which the mechanical responsibility of the body starts to cease functioning, meaning it doesn't make a heart anymore, it makes a big lump of flesh, and it doesn't beat. It's unable to take on the life force that is out there. Well, probably not. And if it did, it would be so incredibly random that its chance of making an erroneous life force, something body that can't function properly, if this was some random thing that was occurring simply because of just the sheer inability for a protein pattern to procreate properly, and again, yours have been working great your whole life, the human race would cease to exist. All races would cease to exist because they would simply evolve out of what they are. They'd go from order to chaos and they'd release themselves, right? So what other things can make things happen? Well, outside forces are where I think a lot of us think that things occur. What could be some outside forces? Well, let's go to de Lamarck, a French guy who apparently was considered a peasant at first. Napoleon became the king of France. He was a cool dude, despite what England will tell you. And he's a scientific man. He was a calculus major. So he was capable of listening to de Lamarck's pitch at some point. And he became the czar for, I think he was a science czar, literally. It's kind of a Russian term, but he's a science expert for all of France under Napoleon's rule. Because Napoleon didn't care about your class. For everyone who tells you Napoleon was a jerk-off, and you've ever been discriminated against, Napoleon was the guy you could go to get a fair trial. I don't know if he was racist or anything, but he didn't care about whether or not you were a poor person or a rich person, according to the story of de Lamarck. Now, what de Lamarck figured out was that in order to advance any form of evolution, which didn't exactly have that phraseology, his French translation of what he called epigenetics. Epigenetics is really the only hope for anyone trying to put together an argument for evolution. I can assure you that various areas of epigenetics are a gift from our Creator, whoever put this place together, and that it absolutely, positively does happen. But what is it? Well, de Lamarck started looking at the idea of saying, okay, that lump of coal analogy must have been in de Lamarck's mind using something. I've got a living being. It's not being interacted with. Would it change without something interacting with it? And I think he answered that question emphatically, no, something has to interact. And so then he started to meticulously observe humanity and all things that were living and realized, okay, there's a whole bunch going on here. The environment interacts with you. You know, there's an interesting thing about the races on Earth as it relates to their geographical origin over time. Imagine you were a race of humans, and you were in a very amicable area of the world Really nice weather, between about 73 and 83. Lush forests or jungles or tropical areas. Lots of food, both livestock and fruit, fish. And you were able to be in a very peaceful sense for thousands of years. You developed agriculture. You figured out the stars and where they're going to be in winter and summer, and you figured out when to plant and all that good stuff that we just talked about recently. All right. Well, you only typically scale to the occasion, right? You only, like in the movie Unbreakable, you only scale to your threat. And so, as brilliant as the pre-dynastic beings were, whoever they were, absolutely, positively not Egyptian. Small digression. I was watching an Uncharted X episode where he's crawling into these beautiful subterranean caverns, and it turns out that the Egyptian people have been dumping their trash into these subterranean tunnels. He filmed it, and it was just jaw-dropping that these individuals would want you to believe that they built all this amazing stuff, when one, they never evolved up to the pyramids in the current day and age, and now they're dumping their trash inside the most amazing historical accomplishments of man, which are these catacombs that go all the way underneath Egypt. Just heartbreaking. So this group of people is existing in this really nice location, and they peak out pretty quick because the need to evolve beyond what they've discovered is unnecessary. You look at the Indians in that's what we call them, the Peruvian natives in the jungles of South America, or you look at the Africans in Africa who are still very tribal. You cannot slight them for not having, FM radios and VCRs and cell phones, because they are in complete balance with nature. It's a brutal world in Peru, especially because they still have tribal fights, and they genocide each other, and they overpopulate, and they kill each other off. It's crazy. Tiny bit of that happens in Africa, but most of that happens in very populated areas where you got a whole group of people with no weapons, and another group of people have been given all the weapons by somebody who wants that area cleaned out. And you have the genocides that you've heard about. But the reason why we might put them in the category of primitives, not in a negative way, but just in a absolutely scientific way. They're very happy people. Again, they're in balance. They go out and hunt what's available. They just know everything to do with their area. Native Americans were very similar. And the reason why all of us albinos out of that area went north, and the reason why I think potentially there was this huge advancement in Europe, was strictly, and Asia and various areas, when the terrain and the environment became very hostile. When you get up into weather patterns where, man, it's super duper hot in the summer and super duper cold in the winter. So you're having to manage two complete weather systems. It also makes growing things have very brutal cycles. You cannot grow a bunch of things in the winter that you can grow in the summer. Other tropical areas like Cuba, you can grow tobacco, I think, damn near year round. There's some torrential rain problems and that kind of stuff. But there's a whole bunch of things you can grow in the tropical equatorial region of the world. It just seems that the races that got into really bad weather and really hostile, hills and, like the Swiss Alps and that kind of stuff, there's an amazing advance in their intellect, because as they perfected their brains to survive, as more technology and social patterns and various needs arose, we were able to, one, conceive of them and then execute them, because we'd already executed a bunch of other really tough stuff. All right. That's an example of how the outside environment can cause the human condition to deprecate things in the human body that are necessary and push things that are really necessary. You get into an extremely hostile area, and your entire being is being pushed up, because you have to have strength. You have to be very resilient, because it's such a mental challenge to say, I hate this cold weather. What is this crap falling from the sky that we now call snow? We got to dig tunnels and, live like troglodytes. I mean, we've got to do a bunch of stuff until we can figure out how to knit together furs and create some sort of textile to stay warm. Women have dangly bits that are different than men. And so we have to start distinguishing those things. As we want to build things, there's a bit of science in it. Think about man trying to build a mud hut for the very first time. At some point, even in the most primitive areas of the jungles or deserts, they still have to measure something. You see them make arrows with these and bows and things. Well, they're always measuring things. They're doing it with just intuition at first. But the more that we became, aggressive towards each other, we started making long bows, short bows, long bows, axes, spears, pikes, hatchets. Think of all the alchemists that make glass and steel and iron and bronze. Some of it's probably serendipitous, but once you have one experience of melting down some weird dust out of the ground and it starts to be something you can mold, then every time you have something that's kind of like a mineral, you could feel it. These humans that could figure it out could feel it and started going, well, maybe mix these two together and see what happens, right? Now, there's a movie out there called What the Bleep Do We Know? I've mentioned it several times. It's been a while. It's a movie that talks about neuropeptides. It's loaded with PhDs, and then, unfortunately, they bring in this woman who's a channeler. Like, oh my God. It's almost like that's the way the movie gets greenlit. Well, how many PhDs do you have? Oh, we got like a 12 PhDs. Okay. Well, we have to be able to, at some point, if we need to, pull the plug on this movie's credibility. So here, put crazy woman in there, right? She could be brilliant. But, I mean, come on, a channeler? Give me a break. Give her her own movie. If she's really got anything to offer society, then she should be able to get her own script together. But in this, with the actual biomechanical engineers, they talked about epigenetics, and epigenetics are formed in the brain based on your thoughts, based on your perception of your body. You can craft epigenetics to deploy into your body and give yourself the body that you want within the mold of your protein patterns, right? So I can't, most likely, I don't know, but I don't think I could probably convince my mind to do it. If I wanted to be a basketball player and I wanted to be 9 feet tall all of a sudden, it would be a lot of painful bone growing. Probably not. But if I want to stay young, I think I can pull it off. This is what I talked about William Shatner recently. The dude's 90 years old and looks like he's 60. It's incredible. I would be interested to see William Shatner's relatives' photographs, see how long they lived, to see if they just have some crazy gene that keeps them really, really young. Hopefully there's no involvement with the recent rumors of stuff that does that. So in that sense, there's something that drops inside you. But what Dave Lamarck had figured out, he acknowledged the most basic principle of touch. Touch from another human being, touch from you to yourself, touch from an animal to you, touch from the weather to you, down to your clothing. That could affect something because it is interacting with your body. He didn't have the scientific equipment to test whether or not it did, and of course no one has a billion years to just set aside to observe whether or not that particular touch changes something. I always put the food a little bit further and further away from your face. Does your neck grow like a giraffe? But the other thing Dave Lamarck apparently figured out, according to Bruce Lipton, if I remember right, in Wisdom of Your Cells, I said the name wrong of the book and I didn't, was electricity. Dave Lamarck had figured out that electricity has to do with the human body. And that was really iced down in scientific history, if I remember right, by the frog leg experiment where they were doing electrodes on frogs' legs and realized they could make a muscle flex. Now, serendipity is an amazing thing in the area of science, especially if you open up your mind to be observing things and listening to things, right? So who knows what they may have been able to pull off. Electricity was definitely not a standard available component of the late 1790s. So other than maybe a magnet or harnessing some sort of lightning bolt, I'm not sure how you would do it. But, we've had static. I mean, people still would walk across the room, most likely in winter, and shock their fingers on pieces of metal by the 1790s. And that itself could probably be orchestrated. Now, again, when everything was stolen during the post years of the Battle of Waterloo, which is when England defeated France, and that's when the Rothschilds took over the entire English economy. A bunch of stuff was carried from France to England, and the way it works, and the way it still kind of works today, although it's a little bit more difficult, was they would have these rich kids, and it was important for the people to continue this sort of facade that, we are in power because we are imbued by God to be in power. We are anointed. It's the story of King Arthur. Lady of the Lake gives the sword of Excalibur to King Arthur, and he's able to wield it, I guess in the name of Uther Pendragon, over the land. So you have a guy named Darwin who apparently sort of felt this same thing. He had commissioned a boat, and he was going down the coast of Europe and down the tip of Africa and made a trip pretty deep towards Asia. And he's trying to take samples as he, walks inland. He tries to take some tree samples and that kind of stuff. At the same time, he's conceiving of man's evolution. But as the story goes, the information was taken from France, from Delamark, and given to Darwin. And it's told that it was so utterly complex and complicated and multidimensional and way outside of the wheelhouse of Darwin's pay grade that he ignored about 80% of it because it simply was so beyond his capability of understanding that he really reduced us down to, look at those bones, because again, there's little monkeys, medium monkeys, big monkeys, and giant monkeys. Well, see, we just must be out there on the end of it all. The problem with Darwin's approach, especially of making it so primitive in definition and design, is like I said in the Giants and Pygmies episode. One does not take batter and put it into the oven, bake a cake, and then when you open it up, you've got a cake and you've got the batter. You lose the previous thing. You do. If we are to evolve into, say, gray aliens or something, then all humanity will get there because it's imperative of our DNA. The only thing that would retard that full evolution into a gray alien would be simply that our DNA was dropped off at such drastically different eras in time that whoever got here first would be turning into the gray alien first. And however many years in the gap between our drop-off and the next species drop-off, they would turn into gray aliens a little bit later. That would be the only thing that would explain that. But monkeys turning into humans means that monkeys go away. Now, what they try to do is say, well, there was some primitive sort of neutral creature that then went up to the super sophistication of Homo sapien and then did a U-turn and went back into, again, the hominid skull. I've explained this several times in different episodes, but we are on the episode, so I must describe it again. The utter sophistication in the upgrade of the Homo sapien sapien is that you really have to say, and most anthropologists will tell you, especially ones that specialize in anatomy and genetics, that the debut of a Homo sapien sapien is so drastically different than everything else on this planet. Not the base components, brain cavities, arms, legs, rib cage, all that good stuff, but the articulated skull of a human being, the increased brain cavity of a human being. Now, we obviously have, I'm going to go for eyesight here. Now, we have animals that have better optics, but mostly it's because of their eyeballs and the way they digest photons. But we have extremely developed eyesight. We have super duper frame rates in our peripheral vision, slower frame rates in the front. But to counteract for having slower frame rates directly ahead of us, we have stereo. And it could be that the metabolic process of processing two images into a stereo image slows down the individual digestion of the frame rates because we're doing a blending process in our visual cortex and throughout our brain. Whereas as our eyes left and right have peripheral vision, it's not be able to mix anything stereo with your extreme left, your 180 left, your 180 right. You don't have another set of eyeballs at your ears to then stereo those together. I think that's probably evolutionarily why that's the case. Again, fun experiments you can do to prove that you have faster frame rates at your peripheral is to lay on your bed in a room or in maybe a sofa where you have a ceiling fan turning. Look directly at the ceiling fan and see if you can see the blades individually without scanning your eyes. You won't. You'll see a blur. Now, look off to the left of the ceiling fan or the right of the ceiling fan and let the fan blades be in your peripheral vision, and you will suddenly see them go from a blur to an individual blade. And that's because you have higher frame rates on the outside peripheral of your mind. Consequently, that was a great design, because if you're looking straight ahead, your threats straight ahead are very evident to you because you're looking straight ahead. It's the animals that would be coming in from the side as a predator. If you turn your head left and right, you can get a 220-degree spin in your mind, leaving just a tiny bit out back, about 80 degrees out back you can't see. But then we've got auditorial things, and there's some other ethereal wind issues where you can feel like you're being stared at. So there's all kinds of interesting indicators we use. One is subatomic, which is the stare, because the eyes are actually projecting mechanisms, because they are, without the eyeballs in the sockets, you have a radar dish that's always going to focus everything straight back out the front. Because we are electrical beings and we throw a whole bunch of that ethereal matter around as we move our heads around, everything's being just spun off of our shape, just like an echo chamber of sound hitting the body from all different sides. And based on the shape of the skull, it's kicking it all back out. That's why you can take your fob from your car when it's low on energy, put it up to your skull, and you can get your car to open up for a little while until the battery goes so below that it won't matter. It is echoing off the chamber of your mind. Of your skull, excuse me. So when someone stares at you, you are getting that little tiny spidey sense inside your mind, inside your third eye or whatever it is, and you can go, whoa, someone's staring at me. Most likely that's a combination of reflecting stuff that's going in that person's face, but it's also probably the energy that they're thinking towards you. And the more they're admiring your physical attributes, it might be really intense. Who knows? Or thinking a really intense thought at you, be it good or bad. But the Homo sapiens sapien is able to speak in syllables. Hominids are not. Bigfoot's included. Yetis. They can only howl, making all those sounds you've always heard in Tarzan movies. It's a big upgrade, folks. And there's no accounting for it in evolution, because they have what's called the missing link. And according to their science, it's about roughly 150 million years missing between the last hominid primate skull and the first arrival of a Homo sapiens sapiens skull. The first act of 2001: A Space Odyssey tries to address this. Bunch of primates running around. Early man, but very, very monkey-like. One tribe goes to a water hole every day to drink. Well, on one particular occasion, another tribe shows up, and they just sort of like wave their hands and yell at the other ones. And so they go home with their tails between their legs, unable to drink from the water hole without having a fight. But the monolith has showed up, and it is a device from an alien culture that is there to teach man and all things it bumps into to go to the next level. The lead primate is looking at a big skeleton of a little boar, and he just grabs a little bone and he starts just ping, 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 and the monolith sees him doing it and goes, this is it, this is my break. He's got the bone in his hand, I'm going to teach him something. And the bone trick was you can actually use that to kill that beast right over there, the one that you're messing with, as a matter of fact, and as soon as you do, you should eat it. And you automatically, while he's just beating the crap out of these bones, it's one of the most amazing scenes in science fiction history. They're playing this amazing music. You see these boars hit the ground, boom, boom, boom. And one of the most amazing makeup jobs ever. You see one of these actors get up there on the cliff and they start just biting the meat off this big piece of the kill. Well, what he's trying to tell you is that eating meat advances the brain and especially advances the visual cortex. They go back to the whole. It's the same character in the movie, but it would have been probably millions of years later if they're going with the evolution model. Here comes the other tribe, and they got bones in their hands. And so the other one's trying to wave him down, and he's just like, he stands up on his back legs. That's one of the other cool things. And he says, just come get it. Just come get me, baby. The guy comes over and tries to, flick at him, which is what gorillas do, as a matter of fact. When they put the mirrors out there in zoos and wildlife centers, that they watch the gorillas hit. And the gorillas really aren't as violent as they portray them. I'm sure there'll be a situation where they'll bite your face off and pull your arms off your body. But they'll really kind of flick at you first, right? Apparently, the way to keep a gorilla from a silverback from killing you is don't look him in the face. Cower down to him. Don't have to lay down or anything, but just don't make eye contact, because that for him means he is still in charge. It's really interesting. Some intelligence there, Anyway, the dude comes over. He swats that guy in the back of the head and kills him. A few other come over and they just beat the crap out of the other team. And the very last scene of Act 1, the dawn of man, he throws the bone in the air because he's just so happy, man. He is on top, baby. And it turns into a spaceship. And if you ever wonder why they want everyone to be vegetarians, it's because meat will make you notice things that being a vegetarian, being sort of at a slow death, you won't. You'll be more docile. Believe me, the elite of the world do not care about your health. Okay, get that through your head and you'll live a great life. They tell you not to do something, that's probably what you're supposed to do. Eat your egg yolks, folks. So now, they've made all these assertions, right? You got some solid state circuits in your body called proteins, and there's a couple models. It either changes by itself because it has a growth pattern that goes over the course of millions and millions of years. It wouldn't necessarily negate creationism, but that would be God basically saying, I want to see this happen. This is like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, but it's going to take 1 billion years to happen. Okay. I mean, literally, one life just keeps going and going and going until it does this big change. Suppose you could assert that. Now, where do we think we've seen some key evidence of this evolutionary process? Well, what's the full ecosystem of evolution? You have a single-celled being that shows up in the ocean. Again, we can't make that happen in a laboratory. And it's so simple and so tiny. It's almost like a Rubik's Cube with like 2 sides on it. How do you not solve that thing just because it exists, right? Well, it's that evolves up into multi-celled beings. Then it gets into being a fish of some sort. And the fish eventually climbs onto the coast of the oceans and starts to kind of go, well, it's kind of fun up here. Eventually, I'm just going to stay. And then, of course, that turns into some sort of being. It eventually, I guess, some of them are great with being on the ground. Some of them that remain, because we all have like 4 limbs. This is something we're going to get into. For each nubule of a living being, there seems to be an algorithm that says, on average, once you get out of the bacterial, tiny amoeba-like creatures, we tend to gain 2 limbs per object, right? So our lower pelvis has 2 legs. Our upper torso has 2. Even our head has 2 ears, 2 eyes, all that kind of stuff. Now, we have fish that do this thing, that go on to land. We have a lot of insects that start underwater, like I believe a dragonfly, right? We got frogs that start off as tadpoles and then become land-based beings. Now, they need a lot of moisture because their skin, it just doesn't like the sun too well. They like to be moisturized. There's all kinds of these beings on Earth. And so I think for an evolutionist, they're like, look, it's right there, man. I'm not trying to tell you God doesn't exist. It's just right there in front of your face. All we're saying is that eventually this stuff gets connected. And even though today, in our tiny little lifespans, we're never going to see anything change, it's still happening, man. Now you get the things like giraffes. And of course, the oxymoron about a giraffe is that it supposedly grew its neck up to eat what's ever up really high. Giraffes are really bizarre beings. I mean, they're really like aliens. They're really strange, aren't they? Now, we obviously know there's plenty of food on the ground. They had no imperative to grow their necks up. They just didn't. And it's hard to suggest that you have a being that's similar to it with a shorter neck and somehow it keeps mutating with a higher and higher neck. And that it can still survive its predators. That's the other thing. Now, the other thing is that giraffes are pretty huge beings. I mean, they're a lot bigger than you think when you're a little kid. I'm not even sure toys actually portray them. When you like buy a pack of toys for your kids, I'm not even sure the proportions are remotely correct. Sort of like when you buy a little model of the solar system, the planet distances are actually correct, but the size of the planets on the tips of the little stalks are obviously thousands of times bigger than they really are, so you can see them. So just like all things, when you get into science, you have things that seem pretty damn decent in terms of theory, and that's all we can have at this point, and things that sort of like don't make any sense. And if you're sort of opposed to the entire overall assertion of a particular theory, it's obvious which side you're going to lean on. If you're a scientist leaning on it, maybe there's a job in it. And so you're like, well, geez, if I totally throw away this degree that I have, or this theory, and I'm going to lose the credibility of my degree goes away, and the jobs and money and lifestyle that I want to live is going to go away. So let's just hang on to it for that reason alone. What I'm unaware of, and I'm sure it's happening somewhere in the planet infinitesimally, is who is still pioneering theories of evolution, besides stepping on the shoulders of perhaps very incorrect theories. Who is approaching this from a bedrock standpoint to say, we really need to understand why a protein pattern would change slowly over time? Can we examine a protein at some super subatomic level where we can understand why it would evolve? There's a book out there called A New Kind of Science by a guy named Stephen Wolfram. And Stephen Wolfram is the gentleman who created Mathematica. So let's just say math was his thing and is his thing. When I was involved with the Tron Legacy project before it was finalized, there was a tiny opportunity for everyone involved to try and pitch something into the script that may have not been seen before. And so everything that was going on in that project was being echoed to me. And one of them was reading this gigantic book, which I think it's at least 2,000 pages, if not more. It's a gigantic hardback book. It's a brilliant read no matter what. But what this guy did was he had this epiphany to try and prove something which was interesting. How many unique particles would need to exist in the universe to create an infinite pattern? Meaning you mix them together, you make them bounce off each other in some fashion. He just used a 2D Cartesian coordinate system to create a fractal pattern. And when he leveled it out to a 2D plane, he realized something very interesting. He was using his product Mathematica to calculate what this pyramid pattern he eventually got, I believe, many, many times. Of course, what he wants is complete noise, and he wants it to never turn into a pattern over time. To summarize, one of the points of this book was that he discovered that to have obviously one particle in the universe with one shape was never going to create this chaotic pattern, just all by itself. It would have to manifest up more particles in its own interactions, which is what we call like an ether particle, would come up with some other sort of quark or subquark configuration of just colliding with itself in the universe to create two, a binary system. He figured out that 1 and 2 creates a pattern very quickly. 5 and up, believe it or not, 5 and up. So like you could have like a Googleplex of these particles, all unique. They're going to create a pattern. 5 creates a pattern. 3 and 4 have a mysterious sort of meeting point in the middle. You get infinite patterns. Now, it could change in a three-dimensional system. Again, his research was trying to be quick with this whole thing, but it does call out to at least the very principle that is the following. We do have a certain magic number, watch it be pi, where it's perfect. It creates infinite patterns. We would have to have that to have the universe that we have, right? Now, as just sort of a base note, because what's very, very interesting about it is that you could have a fern plant and someone else has a fern plant, and you'll grow them. And what's interesting is you could take a little fern petal off one plant, take a fern petal off the other, and compare them and go, oh my God, look, they're exactly the same. But as soon as you zoom in the microscope, you're like, oh, well, okay, all the cells aren't exactly the same, but, overall it's the same. Look at the snowflake nature of the human body. We have all kinds of shades of pigmentation. Instead of that being really cool, as it's been for a long time, it's now the worst thing on planet Earth, right? We have all kinds of shapes and sizes. Noses come in all shapes and sizes. And even though you might be related to your brother and sister, you got different proportions of your mother and your father's DNA, who's made of millions of families before them, right? So what's cool about it is we have sort of this beautiful infinity right here in front of our face, even though, because of our overall designation, and of course some species barrier DNA that we can actually blatantly see, we know who are humans and who aren't humans. We have an articulated nasal cavity, this super duper upgrade to everything else that was on this planet. All right, let's move into how we have this interesting correlation with centipedes, with every other being that is sort of a dog, a cat, everything, which is that for every torso unit, every body unit, there's 2 legs coming off of it. If an ant has 6 legs, it's got 3 torso units. A centipede, it's unit, and it has these legs. And the brilliant part about it is that it's all working in unison with this nervous system down the middle. I think you know that there's this general understanding that the underbelly of a being is very soft and sensitive, and that the backside of a being is very resilient. We typically carry our gut sac on one side of our spine, and the other side of the spine is there to take the blows. Well, that for me is either the sort of design methodology of a creator, or this is part of the evolutionary model. Imagine you are a multicelled being. You could be pretty small. And because of the gravity that we have, there's going to be a point where if this thing tries to either sit on the bottom of the ocean or try to crawl out of the ocean, either way, you're going to have one side's going to be predominantly up and one side's going to be down. If you were to build a lattice with inside this being using calcium structures like a spine with mixed in with cartilage lubrication, the organs by which you use to exist are going to be inside this more delicate region, except for perhaps the skull, which always seems to get this extra wrapping. It seems very intelligent design to me. But at the same time, it might be all involved with the same exact thing, intelligently evolving. The thing is, if we didn't have to evolve, I don't think there'd be all these indicators of an evolutionary process. So again, don't let evolution rob you of the methodology of God, if perhaps that was the technique. This idea that we have to be spawned out of nothing, which is sort of what we throw back in the face of Big Bang people, and boy, do we throw it back in their face. This idea of something from nothing is pretty ludicrous. The idea that a creationist is going to create something from nothing is, I think, equally unintelligent. But now let's say that you have this unit that's touching a soil. Well, it's already a weaker surface. Why is the back getting such reinforcement? Well, one, it has a structure that's fairly reinforced, but two, it's getting all of the outside bombardment from especially photons. When you're a little teeny tiny being and you're getting hit by photons, you could probably feel it a lot more than when you're giant. I think that ether is playing a huge part in this, we're going to talk about this at the end. I think it's why bugs love light. When we go outside, we definitely feel wonderful. Put our bare feet on soil. We feel wonderful because we're getting grounded. We'll get to that. But at some point, what is a limb? A limb is an extension of cells that came off of a particular node, right? Well, what if, by sheer coincidence, one of the mathematical principles of a node, when it starts to exist, is that as it bumps into the ground, bumps into other beings, bumps into a wall, whatever it is, it starts to scratch the surface of this node. Because you're a multi-cell being at this point, it ruptures the membrane and other cells start to leak out. Now, probably for years and years, these would just become sort of calloused nubs. But eventually, they're going to start to exist in some sort of appendage, some sort of extension outside of that rubbed off area. Well, because you're a multi-celled creature, you can wiggle. You can actually wiggle the little node that you have command of, especially when you're smaller. Because you don't have a crustacean shell yet or something. Your skin isn't thick. And so you start wiggling this nub and you got these little extenders out there. You start to realize you can move around a little bit better because you're kind of pushing off the ground, pushing off the wall, pushing off something. And your predators might become the prey. Because as their mouth comes at you and tries to bite you, you just move out of the way. It's too bad, sucker. One of the greatest things that will teach you about some of this is a game that no longer exists that EA produced. Technically, it was probably the first EA brand game that William Wright made. William Wright did SimCity, The Sims. He's a uber genius. He did Sim Earth, Sim Ant. You always learn something when you play one of his games. We bought their company in Walnut Creek and unfortunately forced them to close down their facility and move all their stuff closer to our company in San Mateo. He must have been hemorrhaging cash, and that was just not a public situation. But anywho, he created a game called Spores. And Spores was a game where you would start off as a single-cell being and move your way up through the system. As you survived each sort of test of the creatures in the water around you, you got points and you moved up until you became a however many leg being you wanted to be. The game was pretty easy to play. It was one of the first games in the world, as a digression, that used programmed shapes in 3D as opposed to fixed artwork that was just going to be one way. But as you built this being, you got to choose whether or not you had pinchers in the front, antennae for some reason, a tail that did one thing, a tail that did another thing, how your nodes worked out. And this is where it really dawned on me about this. Okay, now you're letting me live inside this subatomic world. Not really subatomic, but metaphorically subatomic, single-cell, multi-cell world where I get to kind of interact with things. And it started to get me hip to sort of the mechanisms of fundamental life itself. One thing that always puzzled me is if we were simply placed on this planet and man is the most important thing that God has created, then why so many other things? I mean, I understand some livestock, maybe some predators of ours to teach us how to become hunters and defend ourselves and evolve our minds. But, why is there like 1,000 species of praying mantis or, like a dozen different wasps in the world? Like what? Why wasps anyway? Really? Flies, come on. Do we really need them? I think we can use bees to pollinate everything. Seems to be a lot of overachieving. But when I look at the world, plants included, I see, if I think about God creating this or an alien culture, subset of some sort of creationist, I definitely see intelligent design everywhere. Because of what I always say in many of the episodes, I personally believe that everything that is alive is beautiful. That blows my mind. Praying mantis is seriously one of the most gorgeous inventions ever. It's a hideous little thing. When you want to be another praying mantis, you're like, hey, baby, can I get you digits? She's like, if I can eat your head. Okay. Can we do the little do beforehand? Yeah. All right. So just as soon as I make that weird sound, you can eat my head. So what could life be? Let's talk about that for a split second. I was thinking about making an episode, which I think I'm just going to fold into here. And I was going to try to make a silly name, something about like tube life or life tubes. If you reduce the universe down to ethereal particles and the flow of ethereal particles, you are basically reducing the whole universe down to the laws of thermodynamics, of fluid dynamics, because it all moves very similarly, right? It's just based on the resistance of the subject and the substrate we're talking about. When I blow out the smoke on this cigar, right, you get to see how smoke moves around. Well, if you were to suddenly go into the ocean, and it's a pretty clear ocean, say maybe the Bahamas, and you're only about 10, 12 feet down, that's, in the sand's right there, and there's no sharks that are going to come get you, but you have this little container full of like some sort of food coloring, and you just yank it apart really quick, or you slowly open it, and the food coloring starts to swim around the water. Well, if you could make the water clear and the food coloring a smoke color, it's going to look very, very similar. Same law of physics, above and below. As it is above, so too is it below. And it basically is the most brilliant statement of science you've ever heard, and that's really all you have to hear to totally understand how the entire universe works. We just have a problem understanding how this sub unifying particle, when bouncing against each other, starts to create collisions, which then we call forces. And you keep pushing that up and up and up and up, and you probably have infinite down, infinite up. Who knows? It's really hard for the brain to think about that, so you can just start at an ethereal particle and move it up. When we think about what man needs to have in order to exist, this is some sick horror movie. I do apologize. But could you live without legs? The answer is yes. People are born without legs. Could you live without arms? Yes. We've had humans born without arms and legs. Well, what else could you take off the human body and still have a living being? Well, you'll have a little cartilage and stylistic noses and ears. It's a horrific thought. We have to have all of our tubes. We have to have the tubes that make up our digestive system, the tubes that are inside our kidneys, the chambers inside our hearts, all the arteries that connect all that stuff together. We are, in one regard, a mechanical device of just a combustion system driven by the heart. But in order to run that combustion system, we need what's called a nervous system, which is the overlay of electrical distribution of electrons to send out a coordinated pulse to get everything to respond at the right time. The human body is one of the most amazing, if not the most amazing invention that we know about as living beings. But again, insects are pretty cool, all plants are pretty cool, and all animals are pretty cool. Now, plants are probably the most primitive version of life that we have access to. But don't think for a second they're not alive with the consciousness. They're damn near psychic. I mean, we've kind of proven this, meaning they can read what we're thinking. You love a plant, the plant gets great. The old Steve Martin movie about being the single guy, where you kept getting sent home with a plant. You had to keep it. There was two movies like that. One with Sandra Bullock as well. I believe in that wholeheartedly. That's why I love it when my rose bush just blows up over there. I feel like it knows I love it. My plumeria is fully blooming right now, and I feel like it knows I love it, But what's the most important tubular object or / organ inside the human body? I think it is that which is the brain. And all the components, they're in and around the brain, your pineal gland. All your glands are really your super duper important organs. Your brainstem, boy, you break that thing, you are done. You could get shot in your heart and you wouldn't live much longer. You could have any one of your organs destroyed, and some of them you can live without, most of them you can't. Very important. But you break your brainstem and you're gone the second that it breaks. There's no fizzle out moment. Your body might be making motions, but you're gone. Your soul's been released. The squid, giant squids with brains the size of my pinky. It's a tube. That got me thinking. How do human beings determine whether or not a fetus is alive? They look for the heartbeat. And what is that heartbeat? Well, technically speaking, it's a chamber that has got a blockage in it. It's a tube, and the blood is getting electrical signals. It's flexing all the muscles, but it's squirting this blood through this little tube. Boom, boom. And it gets more complex as the human body or any other living being becomes alive. I personally believe we are absolutely alive the second that little heart starts going. Period. Now, the flash of electricity that comes off the sperm and the egg when they mate, which creates the first subdivide of the cell, that is most likely where the magic of God that we keep referring to occurs. If it was so simple mechanically, then we'd be able to do it in a laboratory. And it has never, ever been done. Doesn't mean they can't tamper with one a second it starts going. Doesn't mean they can't mix human stuff with non-human stuff and get something to grow. The island of Dr. Moreau. I believe for a number of very, very sophisticated reasons, okay, not just some book called the Bible, because I don't draw any of my religious beliefs in God. In fact, I don't have any really, my own, when I say religion for me, it's my system based on some decent suggestions from man. I believe that whatever we truly are consciously is coming from an outside database of knowledge, which is why so many anomalies occur in near-death experiences, kids that are born with previous identities for a few years until they grow out of them. You meet somebody who's dead. Those kind of moments, you just can't explain them away. At a subatomic, subatomic ethereal level, you are creating some sort of current, some sort of shape in the universe where this tubular thing occurs. What's a tube provide? It usually provides entry points and exit points. We have an entry point for our digestive system. We have an exit point for our digestive system. Some politicians have just one of the same, two of the same, right? But the brain seems to have this touch point as well. Without the electrical brain, you don't get the first little heartbeat. So that little shock that occurs when the sperm and the egg do their thing in any living biology, for me, way below our ability to discern mass at this point. And, maybe you know better. They've seen something, but I just did a big dive on this, and there's nothing out there that I know of. If we had a sort of, and for the lack of a better term, a spiritual layer of consciousness that is intangible to the mass that we have here. But if the mass creates a funnel of some sort of attraction, some sort of pressure system, who knows what the exact force combination would be. But it lures the spiritual realm in. And when that occurs, it seems that the flash of energy would be some sort of super fast-moving ether, which, again, you speed up mass, it turns into plasma energy eventually, and then it goes back into an almost undetectable level of speed. But if this inception point is nothing more than the soul joining the flesh to see if it can make something happen, deformities, abuse, chemicals, abortions can easily dissolve away this beautiful configuration that is life, whether that be an animal fighting an animal, a human taking a pill, or other more brutal techniques. Sure, you can stop it. But if you leave it alone, you have sort of a clock, a mechanism, an ecosystem. Energy can go in, flow through it, flow out of it. And that is nothing more than this sort of torus of movement, right? When you have a magnet that's in the shape of a donut and they show you the electrical field that goes through it. Think of yourself starting off at that shape and then elongating the torus into a tube. And then it's just tubes everywhere, right? What are your arteries? Tubes. What are your bones? Technically, they're kind of tubular. Your brain's a tube. Your digestive system's a tube. Your body is so brilliant that if you have low blood pressure, one of the things that can stress your heart and cause heart failure is low blood pressure. because your heart senses the lack of pressure in your blood and pumps harder to try and make up for that lack of pressure. Insanely brilliant. Why do we get like weird gunmen on top of towers in Texas? Because there's a tumor inside their brain, and it's pushing on the tubes. It is not a tubular object. It is either an invasive sort of spiderwebby cancer, or it's a tumor growing in a ball, pushing on the tubes, destroying its functionality, thus destroying the relationship between your cognitive consciousness and this mechanical body, creating an inability to take outside input into your robot body and send it back up to the supercomputer to say, what do I do? When that's injured and you start pinching off the tube, it would be just like somebody, it's metaphorical, but someone could take your internet ether cable, let's say you weren't using wireless, and they just keep hitting a 9-volt battery on the wire, and you're getting a packet loss that's crappy. And now your image doesn't come in right, your file download fails. I mean, you screw up the system. We see it all the time in our world. As it is above, so too is it below. I want you just to remember, as you think through this entire theory, in case you're having your own epiphanies, is that evolution in general is to say that something that is considered alive, not just a rock, but something that has this consciousness, is having perpetual state changes that only go in really one direction. It's the diode of life. You gain some attribute as it is necessary, and you shed an attribute as necessary. Now, we have several human beings on this planet, but overall, when you pull human beings in, the only mutations that we tend to see are those of tails, perhaps, that human beings have from time to time, because it does exist. We have organs like appendix that we don't really use anymore, gallbladders that we kind of don't necessarily need to get bile in our system, but it depends on what you're eating. But there are other areas where we study evolution in much greater detail and much greater reward. Insects, especially, like ants, for instance, there's so many different species of ant out there. There's the guy on the internet that does those really funny videos where he narrates all kinds of stuff. He cracks little jokes. He's really funny. I'll put his channel up on the screen there for you. But he did one on these ants that have these huge mandibles that fire like a like that hammer shrimp thing that breaks the sonic barrier, right? Creates almost like a bubble of plasma energy, and it just tears apart the other fish. It's a gorgeous shrimp, it's a shrimp subset or something. But in this one video, he shows you a bunch of microscopic pictures of the mandibles / eating mechanism chompers that are on the end of the face of the skull unit of an ant. And within an array of species, they can see, and it's a brilliant thing where they lock their jaws open, and it's like a mechanical thing, and then they have these antennae that go out, and as soon as the antenna sense something's in front of them, they know that if they clamp their jaws, because the antennas are a certain length and the jaws are certainly longer when they come in for the close, they're going to take a bite out of you. They're either going to bite your skin sac and make your insides come out, or they're going to clamp into your flesh and carry you away back to the nest if they can lift you. But this evolution of these little chompers, you're either looking at one of two things. You're looking at true evolution as it relates to the epigenetic models of de Lamarck, which is the outside world and the mental capacity within the being is figuring out that it needs to do this to make things work. Or, because you could say survival of the fittest, which is just simply to say the mandibles that worked, that creature went forward. There's definitely 1,000% truth to that, right? The ones that didn't, they died off. But if you can give them a little bit of credit to say they still had to develop strategy. Insects have so much strategy, it is ridiculous, right? Or is it the tarantula hawk, man? I have one in my backyard. I'd never seen one of these things in my entire life. I even had someone argue with me that I didn't see one, that they don't have them in Southern California. And so I showed them the picture I took of it in my backyard. And they're like, oh my God. And this thing is like nearly 3 inches long. It looks like a big ass wasp with bright orange wings. And I knew just instinctively, man, I'd never seen one in my life. I had no idea what it was called. Later, I watched that dude get himself bitten by it. I knew not to get, it was one of those decadent, beautiful, and not like I touch bugs necessarily. But man, I knew just stay away from that thing. And apparently its sting is only second to the bullet in. But then again, he got bit by a centipede and that rocked his world. But the tarantula hawk has figured out a technique for stinging the underbelly of a tarantula. You would think that those two wouldn't be necessarily neighbors in the prey predator category. I'm sure a tarantula wins every once in a while, but man, the tarantula hawk is just it's just alluring. I mean, it'd be like the sirens of the mermaids, the old stories where they would sing a siren song to you, the sailors, and it's just so entrancing that they go out and then they get killed. I guess I don't know. I recently heard, you tell me if you've heard any different than this. I was watching this anthropological video, which loosely mentioned the fact that mermaids up until like the 1800s have always been female and never have a male out there. And somehow I thought, well, because Disney does both sexes, you know, and Little Mermaid, and that's like the best documentary ever. But you see, I mean, I haven't heard of that being the case, but then there's all kinds of like male warriors. The was it not the Nephilim? It was the Fumarians. Yeah, the Fumarians, which I put in my Kukulkan script. Definitely got some male dudes in that race. Big, giant colossus, half fish, seemingly half human things. They don't really look like humans up above, other than they've got sort of like the upper torso and that kind of thing, big ass spears. Beautiful, but they're still fishy at the top, you know. The argument that evolution is trying to kill off God has merit, because that's typically the next thing out of someone's mouth. Here's how I view it. Do I think that man will evolve genetically over time? Yes, and perhaps no. All at the same time. Do I think we come from monkeys? At this stage, no. Honestly, as crazy as this sounds, because of the sudden introduction of the Homo sapiens sapien design, I'm now leaning towards outside intervention more than ever. That something came here, worked with the indigenous DNA, and said, well, let's make it more like us, but we don't breathe this oxygen stuff. So we got to, borrow the respiratory system from some of the animals that are here that use oxygen, but we're going to mold this thing into more like us. They're going to need articulation for phonetic language. However, my view of evolution at a minimum on Earth is the fact that we have so many races on Earth. And we still haven't come into like this one unified female and unified male. I don't even know how many millions of years that would take. As long as you have a group of folks living on an island in New Guinea or something, and they're not interacting with the rest of the world, then they're going to have a gene pool that we don't have. The Basques from the mountains of Spain apparently have a true genetic difference in their brains. It's minimal, but it's different. It's interesting. We just haven't made it with them enough to either dilute that out of their system or to spread their system to our system. As far as us turning into something very different than what we are today, I would say unless the outside requirements do change considerably, creating a requirement that we simply don't have today, I would say no. And weather's never going to probably make that happen necessarily. Now, could we get thicker skin and what have you? Well, combine all the races together on planet Earth, and you're going to get, hopefully, the benefits from every single race. And that, In one case, there's a race that has a much more, much thicker skin. They can take a lot of sunlight. Other ones are pale, and they really get a bunch of skin cancer. And again, once you start sequestering yourself away from the sun as a cultural argument for looking pretty, when the human body needs vitamin D to activate everything that's inside your body, which is why you can get a cold in the wintertime because you're inside too much. Because sometimes you're in a world where just sitting out back like me, even though it's cold, I can get some sun. You can't do that as easily in other parts of the world unless you work it into some sort of structure that will protect you from the elements. I also see everything that's going on here very clearly. Very, very clearly. The work of a creator. There is design in everything that I'm seeing. I was trying to think, is there an area of the world, a species of the world, in the phylum class kingdom thing that is ugly? And, the only place I think we find things that are truly ugly, because there's two ways to perceive ugly as a human being. There is something that is a threat to you. Like someone could say, the tarantula hawk is ugly. A spider is ugly. Some other wild-ass insect that just exhibits all of the instinctual instincts we have embedded in us over the course of however many years we've been here, to say, man, that thing will kill you. Stay away from it. Some people think snakes are ugly. I think those things are beautiful, but I also think they're deadly. It doesn't mean that they're ugly, right? There's that little blue fish that's, I think, found in, actually, I don't know what you say, but it's one of the most, the guy who did Daily Dose just did one in April of 2021 where he talked about it. It's one of the most deadly stings you can get in the ocean. I don't know if it's a jellyfish or what it is. It is, hands down, just the most gorgeous little flying washcloth of blue and black and just spot. I mean, it's just amazing looking, right? But the only area I can say is there's some fish that have developed an ectoskeleton sort of, so that when the predators look at them at the bottom of all that sandy ocean, they're resembling the bottom of the ocean. And so when you pick them up, and some of them, like, it's the one that you're not supposed to step on with your feet, because they also secrete some sort of poison, so that they can protect themselves. You can tear your feet apart really bad. Nothing else, just a hard shell. But very jagged, calcium sort of ectoskeleton. Well, you might look at that and go, wow, man, that really looks like dirt, and that's just not as pretty as this spider mantis thing. True. It's not sleek and like a Lamborghini, but in its own way, it is so utter bloody ingenious that you have to give a beauty element to it, in my opinion. Human beings are probably capable of creating the oddest looking beings on this planet, if you really want to get down to brass tacks. Dogs, cats, lions, tigers, elephants, they're just beautiful. Turtles and birds and, everything. It's just amazing. Look at plants. Plants are just insanely beautiful. Even those gigantic flowers that stink really bad. On one level, you can say, well, they kind of look like a baboon's ass, and they're supposed to smell like dying flesh, which attracts all the flies that they want to eat. But still, from a design standpoint, it's like, wow, that thing distributes itself in the Fibonacci pattern. It is a plant that imitates the look of flesh. It has a flesh color, even sort of like the variable reds in flesh. Pretty brilliant. So I would encourage each one of the groups to go in the mutual directions, but to probably maintain their core belief. I'd encourage the evolutionists to see the beauty in all things and realize that doesn't just happen out of thin air. We don't have these weird mid-state beings, do we? Do we have like an area? I mean, you tell me, is there a coastline somewhere where we've got this weird creature that keeps spawning and it's just dying? It's almost the second it spawns, but it's able to create another spawn before it dies because it's sort of some failed model of evolution? No, not that I know of. Everything's working really well. I mean, yeah, you can have a chemical spill and create some pretty weird-looking stuff, three-headed fish and all kinds of stuff. On the creation side, I'd say, well, here's an analogy for you. If I were to ask you a couple things. One, did God create everything that's on planet Earth? And if so, did he create one or two things? Did he create millions of things? And if you look at the science of how many things are extinct on this planet, it's the majority of everything that's ever existed. Okay. Why do you do that? Especially if you think if you're an extremist and you think the world's only like 5,000 years old. Gee, that's a lot of work, a lot of fossils in the ground for no reason. Why would they even exist? What's the point? But if you were to look inside, I say, like, I got God's toolbox right here, man. Or I don't even show it to you first. You're in a room, you're in a church, you're in a pew. You just said a prayer to God, and I said, I got God's toolbox outside. If you were to trust me, how big do you think that toolbox would be? Is it a little tiny toolbox with just like a Phillips head and a flathead? Are you envisioning like instruments you've never seen before? Amazing design kits and electronics and all kinds of cool stuff, because you know that everything out there that's made is way more complicated than any Ferrari engine. Don't you need like 300 tools to fix a Ferrari engine or something? So if the beauty of being alive and getting into science, which we know that there's flying quote science, which we try to stay away from, and then there's real exploration of the observable. Are you going to deny the beauty of God's creations and then meet the dude up in heaven or whatever, if that's what you think, and go, yeah, I told all those people all that other stuff that's down there. It's just all an illusion that you only care about man. That reduces a pretty infinitely omnipotent being down to something you can hold in your hand, which is subliminally making sure that your ego can contain God. There's no thought God can have that I can't completely understand, even though you may quote the phrase to the contrary. No, you don't like God unless you can keep him in a box. Allow the fingerprints of God to be in your face. That's my advice. For a scientist over on the evolutionary side, remember, something never, ever, ever comes from nothing. Make sure you understand that we're unable to spawn life out of just stuff in a laboratory. That little spark that happens when life occurs. We can't do that. And I'm going to make a prediction that if it ever is claimed that they can create a spark where, again, you don't have a sperm and you don't have an egg, but you're able to sort of like push together the mass that is a cell, and you're able to synthesize a direct duplicate of a human cell, and somehow that thing divides, you will have created the mechanism of life without life in it. And it will never evolve necessarily unless you're just creating a total copycat. But again, we can't take a cell and grow back a finger. So, we'll see where we are in like 2,000 years if we don't kill ourselves, right? There is a junction point between the two. When you dream, I think you're leaving this matter-based world. And it's a gift to go back to where you were before you became this life. The reason why we don't have all the instrumentalities of this world when we're awake, or when we're dreaming, is you don't need them. The really reason why you're dreaming metaphors of this world is because you still are attached to your human body, and it might be a little disorienting to have a dream as your true spiritual self, as a light-based being. You wouldn't understand it necessarily, unless you take DMT, right? What saddens me is this. And I sure hope that the internet is helping to wear down this statement I'm about to make. How many scientists that if they had endorsed a spiritual realm, a spiritual layer that is right on top of this mass layer, might have discovered the true relationship between the soul and the body. But because they wouldn't allow themselves to acknowledge the soul because of the dogma and the indoctrination of their education, they had the brain to do it. They had the mechanisms, the gift from God himself to figure it out, but wouldn't go there. And how many religious people could have advanced evolution and done the same exact thing the other way, but wouldn't do it because the book written in 1611 by King James. Same year they released the full works of Francis Bacon called the Works of Shakespeare. Francis Bacon, which was tasked with making sure the King James Bible was good to go. Citing no previous sources until 1947, we need to work together if you really want to be enlightened, if you really want to reach that beautiful summit of understanding. Until then, we're going to argue a lot. And we're going to argue for the sake of arguing. We're not going to argue for the sake of discovering something. I say have an open mind. Anyone who tries to close your mind, well, don't listen to them. Don't fight with them. Just kind of numb your brain out and go, yeah, oh, gosh, oh, yeah, you're totally right. Oh, man, yeah, of course, right? And then walk out of the room and erase that conversation out of your brain. And once time matters to you and you realize that you don't get any extra time in this world, you'll cease having the conversations at all because it's wasting your time, you know? Anyway, I hope that was fun. It is a frontier, to be honest. I think it is both sides. It's spiritual and it's mass-oriented. There will be, for the entire time that man is on this planet, infinite exploration in all of these areas. And it would be sort of a bummer to have someone come in and with a machine that would explain it all, although that would be interesting. We might go off and do something else more productive with our existence. It's sort of like, when you watch Star Wars 1 in 97, how many of you were super excited that the Force was explained? It was nice to have that be a little mystery, right? Well, you kind of probably like it to be a mystery as to where we came from, believe it or not, if it's fully explained. And maybe that's why it's such an enigma. It in itself is inaccessible for all kinds of reasons we've noted on different episodes. Let me know what you think in the comments. And on that note, if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. You can just subscribe there. Push Command D and brave.com. We've got all the audio, video, social media, remastered season 1, a store, and of course, a couple ways to donate to the site, to the movement, to the show, to all my Patreons. Thank you so much. Got lots of episodes in the can as of this particular airing of the episode, and plenty more coming. And again, if you're new to the show, just understand we go for sort of name brand topics, and then we take a break and we do more esoteric stuff. Let me know what you guys think. I think most of you go for the esoteric stuff, probably just a little bit more than the name brand stuff. The name brand stuff is definitely fun. Like Bermuda Triangle, the moon missions, the Hutchison effect, Coral Castle, all that good stuff. But I think that, we can have those experiences outside of deep thoughts. I'm trying to give you a perspective, obviously, within those areas that is unique. But I think that we're having tons of thoughts that nobody talks about, and this is the place to come to have a nice hour to 2 hour conversation about it. Anyway, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you on the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.